Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named Constellation Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with an astronaut, Jo, driving with her daughter along a remote country road. The radio crackles with a repeated raspy murmur. She keeps a calm face, reassuring her daughter that everything is fine. Soon they arrive at a cabin deep in the woods. After unloading their luggage, Jo quickly dashes outside, discreetly hiding a package containing a mysterious metal canister. Suddenly, she hears her daughter's voice calling from afar, even though her daughter is sound asleep like a piggy inside the cabin. Sensing something ominous, Jo resolutely walks toward the distant voice. The scene flashes back to 5 weeks earlier when Jo was still aboard the International Space Station, reassuring her daughter Alice via video call that she would return to Earth in 84 days. Today, she and her team were preparing for a special mission to experiment with a newly discovered substance that could only remain stable in zero gravity. As everything was set, Commander Paul activated the equipment, but a sudden thunderous explosion echoed through the station. Pressure levels began plummeting as a metal rod flew across the room, impaling Paul's arm. The ground control issued an emergency alert, ordering all astronauts to enter Escape Pod 1 and initiate emergency evacuation. Fortunately, Jo's module regained stability just in time. She spotted a colleague trapped by flames in the corridor, quickly grabbed a fire extinguisher, and cleared a path for their escape. Securing the compartment door behind her, she joined the others for a head count. However, Commander Paul's condition was critical. His arm had been severed, and he was slipping into unconsciousness. Jo took on the role of acting commander, staying behind with the doctor to administer emergency treatment while the others assessed the station's damage. Bad news kept coming. The space station's power and life support systems had sustained severe damage, and the propulsion system of Escape Pod 1 had failed. Only Escape Pod 2 remained functional, but it had room for only 3 people. Yet the worst was still to come. In the ground control lab, Project Supervisor Henry examined the final experiment data received before the incident. Stunned by what he saw, he ordered that no matter what, the astronauts must repair the space station and continue the experiment. Following the order, Jo had no choice but to open the hatch, put on her spacesuit, and step outside into space to conduct the repairs. Upon reaching the damaged area, she found that the power supply system had taken a severe hit, with all external cables completely destroyed. Without specialized equipment, reconnecting them was impossible. The commander, upon hearing this, immediately ordered all astronauts to return to Earth, ignoring the fierce protests of the experiment supervisor. Just then, the sun crested the horizon, illuminating the space station. In the new light, Jo noticed a crack along the station's outer hull, realizing this might be where the impact that caused the incident occurred. She quickly adjusted her position to get a better look, but as she moved the cables aside, a terrifying face appeared before her. The impact object was the corpse of an astronaut. Jo lost her balance in shock, and if not for the safety tether, she might have drifted into space along with the body. After a difficult return to the cabin, Jo received more bad news. Commander Paul had passed away due to excessive blood loss. Now, only 4 astronauts remained, but Escape Pod 2 could hold only 3. They all looked at each other, clearly not wanting to be the one left behind. In the end, Jo made the decision. She would stay behind to repair Escape Pod 1, allowing the other 3 to return to Earth on Escape Pod 2. The command center immediately approved this plan, as the life support system on the station could sustain only 1 person for 19 hours. One by one, her teammates boarded Escape Pod 2 and initiated the separation sequence. Watching her companions drift away, Jo felt a deep sadness. She longed to reunite with her family. Meanwhile, her husband and daughter were already on a special flight to the Space Command Center, accompanied by Commander Paul's daughter, all hoping to see their loved ones return to Earth as soon as possible. Jo was also doing everything she could to make that reunion possible. The power system of Escape Pod 1 had been damaged in the accident, and all batteries needed replacing. As time ticked away, the command center finally received good news. Escape Pod 2, carrying the other 3 astronauts, had successfully entered the atmosphere and made a safe landing, with all 3 unharmed. The relief was overwhelming, but now everyone's hopes rested on Jo. However, instead of immediately repairing the power system, Jo went to the break room to retrieve a bracelet necklace her daughter had given her. She could part with anything but that precious necklace. Jo had just finished replacing half of the batteries when the command center issued a new order. She was to retrieve the new substance and experimental tools from the lab module. It turned out that Henry had originally requested for these items to be brought back to Earth on Escape Pod 2, but the command center director had intercepted the order, believing the recent accident might be related to the new substance experiment. Henry, furious, accused the director of not understanding the significance of the experiment data. This discovery could change the entire world. The director, uncertain, reluctantly relayed the retrieval order to Joe. But Joe hesitated, as she couldn't guarantee there would be enough time to reach the lab after finishing the battery replacement. At this moment, Joe's husband and daughter finally arrived at the command center, and just as they were about to communicate, the signal abruptly cut out. Joe was anxious, watching as the emergency lights in the other compartments began to go out one by one. The backup power must be nearly drained. She could only push aside her worries and speed up her repairs. Suddenly, a noise echoed through the quiet cabin, and she floated toward the sound. Just as she reached the lab, her surroundings shifted, and she found herself inside a building hallway. Curiously, she moved forward, stopping at the end of the corridor to see the necklace her daughter had given her. When she turned back, her surroundings had transformed back into the space station. Her daughter's voice brought her back to reality, and Joe continued toward the sound. Shortly after, she arrived at a wooden cabin, staring in wonder at the snowflakes floating around her as if someone had pressed a slow-motion button. Joe pushed open the door in amazement, discovering that the furnishings were almost identical to those in her cabin. She explored along the path, reaching the end of the corridor where she once again spotted her daughter's necklace. She pushed open the door to see another Alice standing there. Without time to think, she quickly picked up her daughter and started toward her cabin. The cold had left Alice severely weakened, so Joe hurried to start a fire and warm her up. Just as she placed her in the bathtub, Joe suddenly remembered there was another Alice lying in the room. Her mind reeled. How could there be two identical daughters? Turning back, she found that the Alice in the tub had vanished. The other Alice, who had been sleeping, woke up at her call, and Joe moved closer, taking a sniff, realizing this wasn't her real daughter. Suddenly, her surroundings shifted again, and Joe woke up back on the space station. She checked her watch, discovering she'd been unconscious for several hours. Realizing time was running out, she forced herself to accelerate her repairs. Suddenly, a white cloth floated by. She shone her flashlight on it, revealing the commander's body, which had somehow opened its eyes. A chill ran down her spine to her smelly butt, but she forced herself to close them again and gently covered his face with the cloth. The silence around her was oppressive. To calm her nerves, Joe decided to record a message for her daughter. She heard a raspy voice outside the cabin, but when she stopped recording, the voice disappeared as well. Curious, she played back the recording and noticed the raspy male voice mixed in with her own. She turned on her flashlight and searched outside the cabin, eventually spotting a severed hand floating in space. Opening the hatch, she realized it was the commander's dismembered arm. Joe was torn between believing this was a supernatural event or simply a hallucination caused by hypoxia. She focused all her attention back on replacing the batteries. With only 90 minutes left, the escape pod's power system was finally restored. Joe was about to initiate the separation sequence, but was devastated to discover that, due to the communication breakdown, the pod hadn't received the latest re-entry coordinates. Without these, the escape pod might end up landing in a densely populated city. Fortunately, Joe's professionalism kicked in. Using the data from the previous day's coordinates for Escape Pod 2 and factoring in the time elapsed, she managed to manually calculate an updated trajectory. With some time remaining, she remembered the command center's task and rushed to the lab to retrieve the new substance and packing tools, bringing them back to the escape pod. After hastily inputting the trajectory data, there was little else she could do. Whether she succeeded was now in the hands of fate. She recorded a message for her daughter, closed the hatch, and initiated the detachment sequence without hesitation. Just then, the system's warning light flared up. Consulting the manual, she discovered it was a bolt system malfunction, which required 2 people to fix manually. She felt a chill run down her spine, wondering if this was where she was going to die. But miraculously, the bolt system suddenly restored itself. As the escape pod slowly detached from the station, Joe stared in disbelief. She saw a figure standing inside the receding main cabin. This was the most perilous space survival journey. As the escape pod approached Earth's atmosphere, it began to decelerate, eventually plummeting like a comet towards the ground. The command center immediately picked up the signal but realized Joe was using a ballistic descent, making it difficult to predict the landing spot. Just then, Joe received the command center's signal, and with great effort, she managed to press the connect button. The moment the command center heard her voice, there was an eruption of joy. However, as the pod continued to accelerate, the signal was lost again. The command center quickly deployed a search team as they could only roughly calculate the descent area. Soon, the pod reached a safe altitude, and its parachute deployed like a giant hand, gripping it tightly. With a loud thud, Jo finally landed safely. It was unclear how much time had passed, but she awoke, and as she opened the hatch, Jo took in the long-missed fresh air, only to see a wild wolf come into view. She froze in fear, but just as the wolf was about to pounce, a gunshot echoed from a distance. It was the rescue team. Surrounded by medical and armed personnel, they escorted Jo to safety. She finally saw the faces of her husband and daughter, making all her efforts worthwhile. Commander Paul's family, however, wasn't as fortunate. All they received was his cold, lifeless body. Henry, meanwhile, was still fixated on the special substance. He eagerly activated the equipment, pulling up the experiment data, only to see the material inside the device emitting an eerie glow again. At this moment, Jo was happily looking at her daughter. But in the next instant, Alice was the only one left on the helicopter, standing and looking around. Jo realized her surroundings had changed too, and the whole world around her was now eerily empty. When she looked back, her daughter's figure reappeared, but her gaze was oddly vacant. Jo instinctively spoke to her in Dutch, but Alice seemed not to understand. Confused, neither mother nor daughter could tell who was at fault. Watching Jo lying stiffly in the medical scanner, a troubling thought emerged in Alice's mind, that her mother might already be dead. At the next day's press conference, reporters relentlessly questioned the cause of the space accident. Jo was about to respond when a handsome colleague intervened, stating that the joint investigation was still ongoing and there was no comment at this time. Jo just wanted to wrap things up and enjoy life with her family, but the command center insisted that she stay at the space base until the cause of the incident was thoroughly investigated. With considerable pressure from various sides, a large-scale accident investigation hearing was held, attended by all 4 surviving astronauts. The head of the investigation team, Irene, who was also the chief of the evacuation operation and part of the Russian Space Agency, presided over the hearing. When Jo claimed that the object that collided with the station was the body of a female Soviet astronaut from the 1960s, Irene logically dismissed it, wondering how a corpse could float in space for decades amidst all the space debris. Moreover, no reports of any astronaut's death or disappearance in the vicinity had ever been received by the joint agency. She suggested that Jo's story of the female corpse was a hallucination caused by oxygen deprivation. Neither side was willing to concede, as confirmation that the collision object was indeed a Soviet female astronaut would make Russia primarily responsible for the accident. After the hearing was adjourned, Jo returned to her quarters for a meal, noticing that her husband's hairstyle had changed. She liked it, which surprised him, as Jo had never complimented him this way before. That night, Jo, still struggling to move, was helped to the bathroom by her daughter, but stumbled along the way. Alice went to fetch her father, and as Jo turned, she found the hallway transformed into the familiar view from the space station. The door at the end had her necklace hanging on it. Her husband arrived to help her up, but the eerie corridor remained there, as if haunting her. On the other side, at the Space Research Base, Henry confidently explained to his assistant that this special substance could generate a dual quantum signal upon collision, but it was challenging to capture. He intended to conduct another experiment at the base, but after an entire afternoon, the substance showed no change. His assistant, holding nearly empty datasheets, advised him to stop wasting time, but Henry insisted he was correct. When he retrieved the equipment yesterday, he had indeed detected a dual quantum state, identical to the data from the space station lab. Ignoring his assistant's skeptical look, he continued monitoring the equipment. Finally, just before midnight, the mysterious dual quantum signal appeared. The old man attempted to record it on his phone, only to find the video couldn't display it. Left with no choice, he used paper and pen to sketch the dual quantum state as a rough diagram. The next day, he excitedly showed it to his assistant, who casually remarked on his drawing skills. Henry, dejected, left the lab, unaware that the special substance inside the equipment had started to glow again. His attention was entirely captivated by a strange sight downstairs. A girl in black had just run into the garage, followed by another girl of similar build holding a toy bunny. It turned out to be Jo's daughter, Alice, playing hide-and-seek with the late commander's daughter. When Alice hid under a car, she saw her friend throw her beloved doll to the ground and stomp on it. Alice quickly ran out to stop her, only to find that both the girl and the doll had vanished. Confused, she ran out to confront the girl, who accused Alice of twisting the truth, claiming Alice just wanted her doll back. When Alice picked up the toy to inspect it, she saw no signs of dirt or damage. As she wondered if it was her imagination, Henry approached, initiating a conversation about quantum physics. It was clear he had noticed something unusual and was eager to give Alice an introductory lesson. He explained that many phenomena in this world cannot be explained by classical physics. For example, an object could exist simultaneously in two different states, like that bunny, which might appear white in one world but gray in another. Between these worlds lies a critical space where, if the bunny enters, its color could shift continuously between white and gray. Alice listened intently, though not fully comprehending, unaware that Henry's dual quantum experiment aimed to simulate this critical space to make objects display two different states. Meanwhile, Jo faced her second hearing. This time, Irene came armed with more convincing evidence. Based on the description Jo provided, Irene had found a discarded space trash bag from the 1970s that looked remarkably similar. It seemed likely that Jo, under stress, had mistaken the bag for a corpse, leaving her momentarily speechless. After the meeting, Jo's handsome colleague approached to comfort her using his sweet tongue, expressing that he had always been on her side. As he reached out to touch her sexy face, Jo instinctively pulled back, surprising him with her reaction. The next morning, Jo and the other three astronauts prepared to pay their respects to the late commander. She still insisted that she hadn't imagined it, and even found an online photo of the same type of spacesuit. Her coworker pointed out that the astronaut in the photo was none other than Irene, the head of the investigation team. Jo was stunned into silence. After the memorial, she intended to stay behind to reflect on the matter alone, but just as she stood up, she thought she saw the deceased commander standing before her. When she looked again, nothing was there. At the following hearing, Jo straightforwardly accepted Irene's theory, stating that what she saw was indeed a space trash bag, as she couldn't bear the thought of remaining there any longer. After finally returning to her long-lost home, Jo felt that everything was as familiar as ever, though she was puzzled about when her husband had changed cars. She distinctly remembered the family car being red. Her husband paused for 2 seconds, confused, before saying that their car had always been blue. Meanwhile, Irene knocked on Henry's dormitory door. It turned out that they weren't just work partners. They had once gone on a space mission together, and their relationship was much deeper than it seemed. Rumor had it that Irene was terminally ill, with only a few months left. Henry decided to cherish the little time they had left. However, just as they were becoming intimate, Irene suddenly transformed into a dried corpse. Simultaneously, on a cruise ship in international waters, another Henry called a detective investigating him onto the deck, insisting he had never experienced a space accident. The detective accused him of lying, believing Henry was responsible for the deaths of 2 colleagues in a space station accident 30 years ago. Enraged, the old man pushed the detective overboard, sending him to meet Satan. According to Henry's dual quantum theory, the bolt malfunction Jo encountered on her return indicated that she had died in World 1. The one who safely returned to Earth was actually Jo from World 2, though somehow the two worlds' consciousnesses had merged. It's possible that the commander Paul was still alive in World 2 and helped Jo resolve the bolt malfunction, enabling her to return to Earth. The dried corpse Jo encountered in space was actually Irene from another world. When Alice saw someone destroying her doll, she was actually witnessing her counterpart from the other world, a truth Henry had already discerned. Intriguingly, Henry's counterpart in World 2 had also killed the detective from World 1, which could lead to unforeseen consequences. In World 2, Jo's marriage had effectively ended, and she was romantically involved with her handsome colleague. However, Jo in World 2 remained deeply in love with her husband, creating subtle discrepancies in their memories, like the different car colors. After returning safely from space, Jo found her once familiar world becoming strangely alien. Her family, colleagues, and even the color of her car all seemed slightly off from her memory. Her husband and daughter were planning a belated birthday celebration for her, and during a trivia game, Jo accidentally said her name in Swedish. The room fell silent. Neither her husband nor daughter had ever heard her speak of this, yet Jo was certain she'd mentioned her daughter learning Swedish multiple times. Her husband, Magnus, was filled with suspicion and confronted her, questioning why she seemed so different since her return from space. Their relationship had been strained even before, and he'd been preparing for a potential divorce. Jo, who had longed to return to her family every moment she was on the space station, was now at a loss. But Magnus's demeanor remained cold. Jo began to wonder if her memories were failing her. She took a closer look around the house, noticing a piano in the living room that she couldn't recall anyone in the family playing. Determined not to avoid the issue, Jo tried to have an open conversation with her husband, but Magnus immediately launched into a tirade. In his view, Jo had emotionally abandoned the family long ago. Even if she hadn't gone to space, she rarely spent weekends with them, leaving Magnus to take their daughter alone to the cabin in the woods. Rumors had spread among their friends that Jo was having an affair with her handsome colleague, and Magnus had resigned himself to the idea, even hoping she would admit it openly. Jo was stunned. She'd never been involved with any colleague, holding only her husband and daughter close to her heart. But Magnus was skeptical and turned to search for their daughter, refusing to believe Jo's denials. Jo understood the gravity of the situation and promptly sought out a psychologist. The shifting attitudes of her husband and daughter, as well as her own memory lapses, were greatly disturbing her daily life. However, the psychologist was quick to diagnose her with post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from her near-death experience on the space station. The doctor explained that many high-risk professionals, including soldiers, had suffered from this condition, which could eventually lead to heightened irritability and emotional instability. She prescribed her a box of antidepressant sedatives, claiming they would effectively alleviate her symptoms. Jo accepted the box, but deep down she was highly resistant. Such psychiatric drugs could dull her responses, making it impossible for her to continue as an astronaut. After leaving the medical office, Jo donned her uniform and returned to the space agency, where her colleagues welcomed her back with open arms as a brave astronaut. The only person whose expression remained conflicted was Henry, who, from his vantage point, gazed down at her with a look of guarded secrecy, as though recalling a decades-old space death incident. At that moment, a representative from the National Space Agency brought some unfortunate news. Henry's dual quantum entanglement experiment was being suspended due to a lack of progress. He fell into a long silence. Soon after, he approached Jo, claiming that the experiment was on the verge of a breakthrough and inviting her to the lab. Casually, he asked her if she had seen anything unusual in space that shouldn't exist. Jo recalled her experiences, prompting Henry to share a bizarre story of his own from years ago. A colleague's son had died, and during a spaceflight, the astronaut almost encountered a fatal accident but was saved by a child's voice, later confirmed to be his own son's. Henry said he'd heard similar stories and urged Jo to reflect further. At that moment, fluctuations appeared in the experiment data, and Jo leaned in to investigate, her mind once again flooded with scenes from space. After leaving work, Jo went to pick up her daughter from school. Her daughter's teacher informed her that Alice had been exhibiting reclusive behavior, which might relate to her home environment. Jo noticed the teacher exchanging glances with her husband, and later questioned him, asking if he was particularly close to the teacher. Magnus vehemently denied it, accusing her of being overly sensitive. Back at home, Jo found her daughter missing, only to discover a familiar necklace charm on the wardrobe door. Alice was hiding inside, explaining that she often found comfort sitting in the closet. Jo felt both sympathy and surprise. In her memory, Alice was always cheerful. When had she become so withdrawn? After Alice went to sleep, Jo walked over to the unfamiliar piano in the living room, placing her hands instinctively on the keys. A melody flowed out as her fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, but Jo looked terrified. She had played the entire piece flawlessly, as though her muscles remembered it, despite having no recollection of ever learning to play. Jo finally accepted that something was wrong with her. She prepared to follow the doctor's advice and take the sedatives, but the pills looked strangely familiar. She recalled being advised to take vitamins during her rehabilitation at the base, where the nutritionist had strongly recommended them. Upon closer inspection, she realized that the vitamins from the base looked identical to the sedatives she now held. She rushed back to the company lab that night, determined to find out if they were the same drug. Chemical analysis confirmed that the so-called vitamins were actually memory-suppressing sedatives. Jo was stunned, unable to fathom why the company would do this, and hurried to the medical office to access the records. The records revealed that multiple astronauts had been prescribed the same medication upon their return from space, all reporting sightings of things that shouldn't exist. At that moment, the room's lights flickered on, and 2 staff members entered to deliver supplies. They seemed oblivious to Jo's presence, and she called out to them defiantly. When the room dimmed again, the two delivery staff were gone. A chill ran down Joe's spine to her butt, and she rushed out of the room. In the hallway, she saw Henry still in his office, talking to an image of himself on the screen. He turned to her and warned her to stop her curiosity. The scene shifts as Joe's handsome colleague suddenly enters her office, stating that the two of them need to have a serious talk. He mentioned that they had agreed to leave the space agency together so they could be together forever. Joe, however, stared blankly, unable to discern whether her memories were deceiving her. In the afternoon, Joe was invited to give a talk at her daughter's school, where she once again saw her husband and the teacher exchanging furtive, intimate glances. Unable to hold back, she erupted on the spot, causing the children to burst into laughter, which only deepened Alice's insecurities. On the way home, Alice ignored her mother's protests and played music on her phone, which seemed to trigger something in Joe, causing her to experience flashbacks of the space station and nearly leading to a car accident. Back home, the handsome colleague showed up uninvited, declaring he had come to confront Magnus and intended to run away with Joe. Joe was stunned into silence, unable to recall any hormone affair with her colleague. Magnus, feeling increasingly betrayed, demanded answers, and the colleague added fuel to the fire by suggesting Joe might be mentally unstable. As he left, he advised Magnus to contact him immediately if she displayed any erratic behavior. Furious, Magnus stormed out. Joe felt her life spiraling into chaos. She noticed a package on the table containing 2 cassette tapes sent by the Joint Space Agency team. One tape was a recording Joe had made on the space station, which she curiously played, hearing first a raspy male voice, then her own message. The other recording was a 1967 message from the Soviet astronaut before her death, beginning with the same raspy voice. Just then, Alice, awakened by the noise, wandered into the hall only to find that the downstairs hall was hosting a memorial service for her mother. Across the room, another Alice turned her head and looked directly at her. The vision quickly faded, and the disturbing images vanished. Seeing Alice's fear, Magnus instinctively placed her in the closet, a habit that seemed normal to him, though Joe protested it was inappropriate. Magnus retorted, saying Joe was overreacting as they'd always done this. He concluded that Joe really needed her medication, while Joe became convinced that others were conspiring to trick her into taking the drugs, all to suppress what she'd seen in space. Frustrated, Magnus picked up the phone, preparing to call the handsome colleague. Joe, enraged, pushed Magnus to the ground with force, leaving him motionless. By now, it's clear that Joe crossed into an alternate parallel universe due to the experimental substance, while the original Joe actually perished. In Parallel World 1, Joe was a devoted wife who cherished her family, as evidenced by the family photos she kept in the space station. Her daughter was cheerful and outgoing. In Parallel World 2, however, Joe was a disloyal wife involved with her handsome colleague, rarely paying attention to her family, which led to Alice becoming reclusive and prone to extreme behavior. This explains why, upon entering World 2, Joe found her husband and daughter acting so strangely. Previously, Joe accidentally pushed her husband, causing him to pass out. But before he lost consciousness, his phone had already dialed her handsome colleague's number. Joe quickly hung up and dialed emergency services instead, giving them her address and explaining the situation. She hurriedly packed her things, feeling that the space agency intended to harm her, possibly to cover up the fact that she had seen a corpse in space. Otherwise, why would they insist on giving her psychiatric drugs? The strange cassette tapes she received only heightened her suspicions, as they contained recordings of her conversations with the command center, even though she distinctly remembered that communication had been cut off during that time. Determined to uncover the truth, Joe returned to the space agency, hoping to find any records of those calls in the archives. Unfortunately, her clearance was too low, granting her access only to recordings from the quantum entanglement experiment just before the collision. Thinking quickly, she removed the experiment equipment from the lab, deciding to take it for further study, regardless of whether it was related to the collision or not. Next, she needed to focus on getting herself and her daughter out of the city. On the way, they stopped at a diner for a meal. Curious, Joe asked Alice why she liked hiding in the closet. In her memory, her daughter had no such habit. Alice's response left Joe unsettled. She said there was a woman who often whispered strange things, which frightened her and made her hide. Joe, thinking it was Alice's imagination, suggested she draw a picture of the woman to face her fears. Then Joe used a public phone to dial a number, the contact who had sent her the tapes. Initially planning to visit, Joe was surprised when the person on the other end abruptly hung up. Intrigued, she looked up the sender's information. News articles revealed that the individual had served 6 months in jail for fabricating recordings. Joe felt a wave of dizziness, but was certain that the tape's contents weren't fabricated, as she had indeed said those things on the space station. After calming down, Joe decided to call her husband to check on his condition, but her daughter interrupted, holding up the drawing of the woman she'd seen. The figure was shockingly similar to the astronaut corpse Joe had encountered. Staring at her daughter in disbelief, Joe wondered how Alice could know something she'd never mentioned. These uncanny events made her resolve to investigate further. Joe's first stop was the address of the tape's sender. After explaining her intentions, an elegantly dressed elderly lady emerged, revealing that it was her brother who had hung up the phone earlier. It turns out, the siblings were amateur astronomers who had intercepted an unusual space transmission using old equipment. They had even been sued by the space agency and briefly jailed for recording these ghost transmissions. Recently, after hearing about Joe's sighting of the astronaut corpse, which the space agency denied, they were reminded of the ghostly transmissions they had intercepted. The brother was reluctant to get involved again, fearing further trouble, but the elderly lady felt compelled to help Joe uncover the truth. She sent Joe the tapes containing communications from the space station, recordings that even the agency's command center had not received, but which she had captured using her old equipment. Meanwhile, Alice saw an old familiar face in a photo on the table. It was Henry from years ago. She learned that he had once visited this place, attempting to retrieve recordings from Apollo 18. Joe recalled that there had been an accident on that mission, with Henry as the sole survivor. From that day on, he seemed like a different person. The elderly lady suddenly signaled for silence, explaining that she and her brother had been under surveillance by the space agency for years. She invited Joe to join her on a trip to see if she wanted to uncover the truth. Strange phenomena often happen in the vast universe. 6 astronauts once reported seeing purple orbs on a space station, a story that even made it to the newspapers. The small freighter began to move, and the elderly lady explained they needed to sail 8 nautical miles to reach an intersection point between 2 spaces where unusual sounds could be picked up. She pulled out a cassette tape containing a 1967 recording of a female astronaut's final moments. A crackling static sound played before a woman's voice emerged. The elderly lady had researched this incident. The only female astronaut launched that day was a Russian named Irene, who returned to Earth safely. So who was the dead woman? As Joe listened intently, the elderly lady inserted another tape. This time, the voice of the commander Paul could be heard, causing Joe to pale. She had witnessed his death on the space station with her own eyes. The elderly lady's expression was stern as she explained that space exploration had been ongoing for over 500 years, and many astronauts who returned were deemed mentally unstable, despite being elite individuals who had passed rigorous tests. Why would they break down so easily? Clearly, something was being hidden about outer space. Joe was shaken and needed time to process everything. Before parting, the elderly lady handed her a few more ghost tapes, and although Joe hesitated, she accepted them reluctantly. Meanwhile, Henry was unaware that the experimental substance had been stolen. He suddenly received a call from Irene, who mentioned a recent article where a Nobel Prize-winning physicist discussed how changes in one entangled particle could affect another's state. Henry pondered this, but upon returning to his lab, he discovered his precious equipment was missing. Trembling with anger, he immediately called Irene, asking for her help. Henry decided to go to the restroom to calm down, but as he did, he heard his own voice on a call. An alternate version of himself, dressed in a floral shirt, was talking in another world. The white-shirted Henry wasn't surprised, writing "Leave me alone" on the mirror with steam. Remarkably, the floral-shirted Henry saw the same message appear in his mirror, scowling before hanging up his phone. Back in the white-shirted Henry's world, he decided to team up with Joe's handsome colleague to track her down, suspecting she had taken the experimental device. However, since the dual quantum entanglement project had lost funding, no one cared much about the theft. White-shirted Henry vowed to find the device. Seeing that the handsome colleague agreed, Henry stormed back into the restroom, glowering at his reflection and saying hello. When he turned again, floral-shirted Henry appeared in the mirror. White-shirted Henry asked if the other had stopped taking his medication, to which the floral-shirted Henry nodded, stating that he wanted revenge for the mess white-shirted Henry had made by sending the entanglement device to the space station. Floral-shirted Henry threatened he would come to his world to settle this. White-shirted Henry smirked, saying that he couldn't. Unexpectedly, the other swore to make him wet his pants. Meanwhile, Joe was preparing to take her daughter to the forest cabin for a retreat. She had too many questions, so she asked Alice to set aside the ghost tapes for now. Surprisingly, the sound quality was clearer than when she had listened to them on the ship. Curious, she held the recorder close to the experimental device, and to her astonishment, there was not even a hint of static. Jo finally realized the unusual properties of the device. At a three-way junction, she suddenly stopped the car, frowning. She distinctly remembered there being no such fork in the road, but Alice casually pointed to the left. They drove over the icy lake road until they finally reached the cabin. After Alice fell asleep, Jo took out one of the ghost tapes. The audio was crystal clear, capturing a conversation she had with Alice right before the space station collision. Then the sound of the explosion played. Jo immediately turned off the player, but Alice, who had also heard the recording, suddenly remarked that the girl in the recording wasn't her, as she couldn't speak Swedish and had never addressed Jo as Mom. By this point, the plot was becoming clearer. In the first episode, when Jo hurriedly took her daughter to the cabin, she encountered another version of Alice. This overlap was likely caused by the experimental device, as in the other world, Jo had died on the space station. That's why this world's Alice reacted with such surprise upon seeing her mother. At the end of this episode, Alice's comments confirmed this notion, that there existed another version of herself. But what shocked Jo even more was the ending of the tape recording. It seemed that in the explosion, it was Jo who died, while Commander Paul survived. This was an event from another parallel world. Jo was finally beginning to understand the truth, while Henry, the experiment supervisor, knew far more secrets. He could even communicate with his counterpart from the parallel world. Whenever one of them stopped taking their medication, the connection between the two grew stronger. Perhaps this was the true reason the space agency insisted that Jo take her medication. The scene flashes back to the moment just before the space station explosion. Commander Paul was making final adjustments to the dual quantum entanglement experiment. Jo, chatting with her daughter, was unaware of the impending danger. Suddenly, all communication cut out, and the space station began to shake violently. Losing her balance, Jo collided with the observation deck's glass. When everything calmed down, Paul followed a trail of floating blood droplets to find Jo embedded in the glass. Blood was slowly leaking out of her head due to pressure differences, so he quickly stuffed a tissue into the hole to seal it and carefully removed Jo's body. Jo's husband, Magnus, received news of her death and immediately took Alice to the space agency. En route on a private jet, Wendy, a girl waiting to welcome her father Paul back, comforted Alice, saying everything would be all right. This world was a different parallel reality. In the previous one, Jo had returned to Earth while Commander Paul had perished into ashes. In an effort to comfort Wendy, Alice even gave her cherished doll to her. It was shocking to see the same events playing out in two coexisting worlds with entirely different outcomes. What was even more puzzling was that the surviving Paul distinctly remembered placing the experimental device on the table, yet after the explosion, it mysteriously vanished. However, he had little time to dwell on it, as the escape pod had only 3 seats. Paul and the alternate world Jo made the same decision, to stay behind and let their crewmates return to Earth. As the bizarre events repeated, albeit with the roles reversed, Paul occasionally heard sounds in the escape pod. When he changed the battery pack, he noticed that the head covering on Jo's corpse had started to lift. Paul hurried over to fix it, unable to resist leaning in for a closer listen. Paul couldn't shake the feeling that Jo was somehow still alive, especially when he distinctly heard her voice in his ear. Growing uneasy, he reported to command that Jo's wounds had reopened and that re-entering Earth's gravity would lead to severe blood loss. Before he received a response, he moved Jo's body out of the escape pod, intending to leave her in the space station forever. Just before he let go, he whispered an apology, only to feel a pressure in his palm as if something held onto him. When he looked again, there was nothing. Meanwhile, Magnus found Alice hiding in the closet. He found it odd for her to be crouched there in the middle of the night, but Alice's personality seemed to have changed. She ignored her father's admonition and closed the closet door from inside. After Magnus left, Alice saw her mother's figure, but when she opened the door, there was nothing. This echoed what Jo had previously experienced with the closet. Perhaps the dual quantum experiment had caused the two worlds to overlap. The next day, while Alice was playing in the yard with her friend Wendy, Wendy's mother called her over, saying that her father Paul was coming home soon. Alice's eyes dimmed as her own mother would also be returning, though only as a cold, lifeless body. However, Magnus brought distressing news. Jo's body would likely remain in outer space forever. Meanwhile, Paul had finished repairing the power in the escape pod and was ready to return to Earth, only to encounter a bolt malfunction that required 2 people to fix. After randomly banging on it, the issue inexplicably resolved itself. Paul stared back at the space station in disbelief, thinking he saw someone standing by the observation window. Upon his return to Earth, Paul received a warm welcome from friends and family. Yet he felt an overwhelming sense of unreality. Just days ago, his living teammates were now only commemorated with gravestones. As he laid down his flowers, he looked up and saw Jo's silhouette, though she vanished in an instant. Paul was unaware that this was a result of the overlapping worlds, assuming instead it was just a trick of his eyes. Meeting with Jo's family, Paul explained his decision to leave her body in the station, insisting he had no other choice. He then began describing Jo's gruesome injuries. Seeing his daughter's reaction, Magnus quickly pulled Paul away, realizing this only deepened Alice's emotional scars. Alice, now visibly disturbed, walked into the parking lot and furiously stomped on her beloved doll, tearing out its eyes in a fit of rage as her friend Wendy tried to stop her. Meanwhile, Paul was plagued by bizarre hallucinations, making him question his own sanity. During an inquiry about the quantum entanglement experiment, all his astronaut colleagues and space station officials insisted no such experiment had taken place. Surveillance footage confirmed this as well, showing no record of the experiment. The inquiry committee further revealed that Paul's decision to leave Jo's body in space was entirely his own, as command had issued no such directive. Finding it increasingly hard to believe, Paul searched online for past space missions and came across a video of a failed moon landing from years ago. To his shock, he saw that the only survivor was an astronaut named Henry. Paul was stunned, as he clearly remembered that particular moon landing had been a success. Despite technical failures that led to the deaths of 2 astronauts, Henry had supposedly saved the mission, ensuring its completion. Paul rushed to the space agency, determined to meet Professor Henry in person, as Henry was the initiator of the dual quantum entanglement experiment. To his astonishment, Henry shook his head in disbelief, saying that after the failed moon landing, he had spiraled into depression, left the agency early, and never initiated any experiments. Paul's surprise deepened. He distinctly remembered speaking with Henry before the space station explosion, with both of them arguing without reaching any conclusions. They were unaware that Paul's symptoms mirrored Jo's. His body existed in one world, but his memories belonged to another. It was likely that the experiment's activation had caused the 2 worlds to alternate, possibly due to their fatal accident. Realizing something was off, Paul began to reevaluate his life. He noticed that his interactions with his wife and daughter seemed to make them uncomfortable, as some of his habits now felt foreign to himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that something inexplicable had happened in the space station. Meanwhile, Alice, equally confused, angrily shredded the gift meant to celebrate her mother's return, only to hear piano music from the corner of the hall, though there was no piano in their home. Watching the mess around him, Magnus concluded that his wife's death had profoundly impacted their daughter. He immediately sought help from a psychologist, who suggested holding a funeral for Jo, as rituals could help Alice process her grief. Magnus took this advice and quickly arranged a memorial at home, but Alice stubbornly hid in the closet, refusing to come out. She asked how they could say goodbye to empty air since her mom was still in outer space. Left with no other choice, her father went downstairs to greet the guests. Meanwhile, Paul lingered at the doorway, too afraid to enter. He blamed himself for selfishly leaving Jo's body in space. More than that, he believed she was still alive. As he struggled with his emotions, Wendy's compassionate gaze seemed to plead with him to go inside. Seeing her father's absent-minded expression, Wendy dragged Alice over, saying her dad thinks Alice's mom was still alive. Startled, Alice turned around, only to see another version of herself, causing Paul to collapse in shock. The sight of Jo made the young girl scream out. After the guests had left, Magnus suggested that Alice take a trip to relax, as the recent pressure had been overwhelming. Without hesitation, Alice chose her mother's favorite forest cabin. Meanwhile, Paul's wife awoke to find him missing and sought out his colleagues at the space agency. They gravely informed her that many astronauts suffer from post-traumatic stress upon returning to Earth, often experiencing inexplicable visions. They advised Paul's wife to be prepared, as the agency would likely suspend him even if they found him. Little did they know, Paul had already arrived at Henry's residence. In this world, Henry's circumstances were far more modest. He lived in an obscure apartment. Paul was even more astonished to find that Henry didn't recognize him. In Paul's memories, Henry had been his mentor at the agency's lab, guiding him through the success of the moon landing. As Paul recounted the tale of Henry's heroic recovery of the mission, a dark expression crossed Henry's face as he realized Paul was describing a different version of himself. Sensing Paul's desire to uncover the truth, Henry abruptly drew a handgun from his desk drawer. At this moment, Magnus and his daughter were already on their way to the forest cabin. When they reached a fork in the road, Magnus noticed that the path ahead was blocked by ice. He suggested finding a hotel in town for the night, but Alice felt strongly that there was something in the cabin and insisted on reaching it tonight, even if it meant walking across the frozen ground. With no other choice, her father agreed to trek with her through the icy terrain to get there. They opened the door with familiar ease, and everything inside matched their memories exactly. Alice stared at the painting on the wall, lost in thought. This was her mother's favorite artwork. Magnus was also moved by the familiar surroundings and couldn't hold back his tears. It seemed that in this world, his relationship with his wife had been strong. Alice comforted her father, reassuring him that she believed her mother would appear again. Late that night, Alice noticed a light outside and looked out the window. To her astonishment, she saw Joe's silhouette slowly emerging from a car. This part of the story primarily served to explain the eerie phenomena from earlier, but shifted the perspective from Joe to Paul. It was actually a story taking place in two parallel worlds, and due to various reasons, the two spaces briefly overlapped. Both Paul and Joe saw a figure on the station platform as they left, but it's still uncertain who it was. Through the window, Alice saw her mother, who had long since passed away. Without even putting on a coat, she dashed out into the icy landscape, but her mother had vanished along with the car. Confirming that what she saw was no illusion, Alice put on her coat, determined to search further afield. At this point, she still didn't understand the marvel of dual quantum entanglement. The reason she could see her mother was because the two parallel worlds had briefly overlapped. In World 1, Joe had just arrived at the cabin, having taken the dual quantum experimental device from the space agency. She planned to lay low here with her daughter, but before she could enter, she heard someone calling her mom. Yet her daughter was right beside her. The mother and daughter went inside the cabin and played the ghostly tapes over and over, listening to a conversation between Alice and her mother recorded before the space station accident. Alice was certain that the voice on the tapes wasn't hers, as she would never speak Dutch. Even more shocking, Alice mentioned that, during a video chat, her mother had introduced her to the experimental device. Joe clearly remembered that no dual quantum entanglement experiment was conducted at the space station, aligning perfectly with the events of the previous episode. Paul's body was in World 2, but his memories remained in World 1. Thus, during the hearing, he insisted that he was performing the dual quantum experiment, even though the presiding officer stated that this experiment had been canceled years ago. After listening to all the ghost tapes, the mother and daughter gradually pieced together the truth about parallel worlds, particularly when one tape contained Paul seeking permission from the command center to leave Joe's body in space. Alice, building up the courage, finally voiced what had been in her heart for a long time. She felt that the Joe before her was not her real mother. This harsh reality was something Joe herself had come to believe, and she decided to uncover the full truth. While storing the experimental device outside, Joe once again heard her daughter calling out to her. She ran back in disbelief, only to find Alice fast asleep. Joe's eyes sparkled with determination as she grabbed a kerosene lamp and rushed towards the source of the voice. The Alice who could call out for Mom was in the second world, and the two did not meet along the way. Not long after, the young girl saw the lights in front of the cabin. She didn't understand why there was an identical house here, and even the key was hidden in the usual spot. She opened the door, finding the setup nearly identical to her own cabin. Searching the rooms, she found no trace of her mother. Out of habit, Alice crawled into the wardrobe on the second floor, just as a strong gust closed the wardrobe door shut. Alice panicked, banging on the door and calling out for her mother. Suddenly, Joe heard the voice behind her and quickly turned around, scanning her surroundings. To her surprise, she saw the light from a cabin not far away. After a short while, Alice, who had been calling for help, found the wardrobe door open, and there her mother stood before her. Joe, trembling with emotion, took her daughter back to her own cabin. She gently sniffed her daughter's hair, confirming that this Alice was truly her own. Joe ran a hot bath for her, realizing only then that there was another Alice lying in bed. Dizzy with confusion, she came back to her senses only to find the bathtub empty, with only one recently awoken Alice in front of her. Certain that what she had just experienced wasn't a hallucination, she told Alice that there was another cabin on the other side of the woods and that she needed to find her other daughter. Alice from the first world, puzzled, asked if she wasn't her daughter. Watching her mother leave in a hurry, she had no choice but to follow. Meanwhile, Alice from the second world had no idea that the overlapping space had separated. After calling out Mom, she realized the bathtub's hot water had disappeared. Wrapping herself in a towel, she walked out of the room, only to bump into her father, who had just woken up. She explained that she'd seen her mother, but Magnus brushed it off as a symptom of longing turned into hallucination. The young girl didn't argue further, instead sneaking out once her father fell asleep, convinced there was another cabin on the other side of the forest, where her mother surely was. At that moment, Joe was trekking through the snow with Alice from the first world, who doubted the existence of the second cabin. After all, many astronauts had experienced similar illusions. When Joe and the Alice from the second world finally reunited, Joe was now certain the Alice in front of her was not her real daughter. Quickly, the girl responded if she wasn't her mom, then who she was. With a vengeful look, she grabbed the device from Joe's backpack and tossed it into the snow. Alice intended to return to find her father, but unexpectedly came upon a small cabin halfway. Curiously, she went inside to explore and found everything almost identical to her own home, right down to the painting on the wall. She saw a recorder on the table and instinctively took it with her as she crawled into the upstairs wardrobe. Alice from the second world stumbled upon a small orb in the snow, then took a few more steps forward and found Joe's discarded experimental device. Thinking her mother was nearby, she quickened her pace and soon arrived at an abandoned cabin, expertly opening the door and discovering a living tabby cat inside. The first world Alice had seen a dead tabby in the same place earlier, bringing Schrodinger's cat to life in this strange parallel. Until you open the box, you'll never know if the cat inside is dead or alive. Alice, from the second world, habitually stepped into the wardrobe, only to find a radio placed inside. Curious, she pressed the play button, and the voice of Alice from the first world came through. It turned out that the other Alice was also inside her own wardrobe, using the same radio model to record her voice. Although they existed in separate parallel worlds, the radio allowed them to communicate across dimensions. Not long after, Joe found this cabin too. Hearing a faint sound from within the wardrobe, she opened its door, only to find nothing but a radio still playing Alice's voice. Realizing that her daughter must have returned to their own house, Joe quickly grabbed the radio and rushed to her car. But she failed to notice that the kerosene lamp she'd left on the table had been knocked over by the wind, setting the wooden floor ablaze. Joe's heart raced as she heard the two Alices talking through the radio. Though in different worlds, they had seen each other through a mirror. They shared stories of their lives, even down to the color of their family car. At last, they confirmed that parallel worlds did indeed exist. As Joe was driving, she suddenly noticed a glow in her rearview mirror. It dawned on her that the old cabin had caught fire. She quickly turned back, but as she approached, the burning cabin transformed into her own home. Without hesitation, she rushed inside, only for the house to shift back into the abandoned cabin where she'd first found the radio. The murals on the walls were engulfed in flames, a dead tabby lay on the ground, and a black cat was wandering nearby. There was no time to ponder. Joe hurried upstairs and found Alice from the first world hiding in the wardrobe, but to her confusion, while she could hear Alice from the second world through the radio, her own voice couldn't reach her. The first world Alice had to relay messages between them. Determined, Joe vowed to find a way to reunite with Alice from the second world. Just then, the flames broke through the mural and thick smoke began rising to the second floor. As the mirror on the wardrobe shattered and flames spread around her, Joe quickly grabbed Alice and ran outside. Meanwhile, her husband was making his way toward the cabin with his colleagues from the space agency. The path was blocked by snow, forcing them to proceed on foot. The lead scientist, Henry, seemed to sense something and veered off in a different direction. Perhaps it was fate. He discovered a piece of experimental equipment Alice had left in the snow. The rising flames ahead caught his attention as he remembered Paul's accusatory words. He realized this was all happening in the second world. With a sudden gunshot, both Henrys from the two worlds froze. Somehow their consciousnesses had swapped. Joe escaped the cabin and handed Alice to Henry, only for him to abandon her in the snow. This was the Henry from the second world, who had quit the space agency long ago and didn't recognize Joe's daughter. The first world's Henry, however, had responsibilities to uphold. Seeing Paul lying injured, he immediately called for emergency assistance. Meanwhile, Joe, having returned to the burning house, couldn't find Alice from the second world. But as she stepped back outside, she was shocked to find Alice, whom she had entrusted to Henry, lying alone in the snow. The extreme cold had weakened the girl to the point of barely breathing. Joe began administering first aid when, suddenly, the Alice from the second world appeared behind her, asking her mother to come home with her. However, Joe made a rational choice. She couldn't leave the unconscious Alice at that moment. Just then, Magnus's voice called out from not far away. Joe had just told her daughter to return to her father, and a group of astronauts came running toward them. The two overlapping dimensions began to separate once again. Alice from the second world reunited with her father, while Joe managed to save Alice from the first world, even though she believed her real daughter had vanished. The scene shifts to Alice from the first world lying in a hospital bed. In her dream, she saw the corpse of an astronaut who said she would take Alice to her real mother. Suddenly, Alice awoke, asking her father where Joe had gone. He replied that she had been taken by the Russian astronaut Irene. Shocked, Alice insisted that she had to save Joe no matter what. Joe, after encountering both daughters, was taken away by the rescuers who arrived in a hurry. After a long journey, she was forcibly brought to a secluded monastery in the countryside. Irene, the head of the Russian space agency, looked on coldly as several nurses skillfully attached circuits to Joe's head. Meanwhile, in the snowy forest, Henry awoke and picked up an abandoned cold atom device. His gaze grew dark as he raised an axe and struck the device with all his might. A shattering sound seemed to echo through space, and Joe, back in the monastery, fell into a deep sleep. It's unclear how much time passed before Joe awoke, finding herself in an unfamiliar environment. An inexplicable wave of panic washed over her, especially when she discovered the door was locked. Feeling dizzy, she waited until the door finally opened and Irene entered calmly. She urged Joe to relax, suggesting that she play a song to calm her nerves. But Joe had no patience for such things, her mind occupied by thoughts of her daughter in the cabin. Irene tried to reassure her, telling her not to worry and that her daughter has just been discharged and is waiting for her at home. Joe shook her head, insisting that's not her daughter and that Irene had been hiding the truth from her, and the medicine she gave her proves it. Patiently, Irene explained that during her recovery, they had discovered Joe was pregnant, which was why she'd been given a unique prescription. Stunned, Joe pushed the pills away. Just then, a low moaning sound came from the ceiling. Irene's face darkened as she remarked that an incurable patient lived upstairs. Resolute, Joe began reciting from a ghostly tape recording, the final message from another world Irene who died in an accident at the space station. Irene turned pale, and she hastily left the room. Meanwhile, back at home, Alice solemnly confessed the truth to her father, that her real mother had died, and the current Joe was from another world. But Magnus found it impossible to believe such a smelly bullshit. The next morning at breakfast, Alice told her father that she wanted to visit Joe at the monastery. Meanwhile, in Parallel World 2, where Commander Paul was still alive, Henry was escorted by several officers to an interrogation room. He was questioned for shooting and injuring Commander Paul the day before. Henry firmly denied hurting anyone, but couldn't explain how his consciousness had swapped with another world's version of himself, while the real culprit had crossed over to Joe's world. To clear his name, he suggested they use a lie detector. Meanwhile, Henry in the first world was thriving. Compared to his troubled life in the second world, he was now living in what felt like paradise. He accused Joe of damaging the experimental equipment and blamed her mental instability on the stresses of space travel. At that moment, Henry suddenly received a call from Irene, who said she urgently needed to see him. They arranged to meet at a restaurant. Henry was pleased to see this legendary woman because in his former second world, Irene had been the second woman to go to space and was the dream of all astronauts. However, Henry's face soon darkened. His memory was of an Irene who had died in a space accident. Sitting across from him now was someone in a situation similar to his own, physically in the first world, but mentally from the second world. Henry was determined to maintain the status quo and insisted that Irene continue to cover up the truth. This was why he had sabotaged the atomic device. Meanwhile, Joe at the monastery encountered an old colleague, someone she'd once worked with at the space station. She thought he would understand her, but he was unexpectedly cold, suggesting that she had developed some astronaut syndrome, a common ailment among astronauts, and was now paranoid. He insisted that she cooperate with the treatment, as he would soon be taking over Irene's role at the space agency. Joe angrily pushed him out of the room but noticed he had secretly slipped her something. When she opened it, she found 2 keys. When night fell, Joe used one of the keys to unlock her door, intending to leave. But then she recalled the strange sounds she'd heard earlier in the day. Quietly, she made her way to a locked room on the second-floor corner. Curiously, she opened the window and saw an elderly man with a scruffy beard. Terrified, she quickly returned to her room, realizing that even if she escaped, she would soon be recaptured. Pleased with her reaction, Irene informed her that the man upstairs was the first man to go into space, but now suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Joe understood the implications. If she didn't cooperate with the treatment, she too would be doomed to spend the rest of her life alone in that place. At the same time, Alice was in the wardrobe chatting with Paul's daughter, Wendy, revealing that Joe wasn't her real mother. Wendy surprisingly envied her. Alice at least had someone who looked like her mother for company, whereas Wendy would never see her father again. Conversely, in another parallel space, Alice from the second world envied Wendy for having her father safely back home. After ending their video call, the 2 Alices both stepped out of their wardrobes. The first world. Alice asked her father when they would go see Joe, casually picking up a radio from the box. Meanwhile, second world Alice, preparing to leave this sorrowful place, found an identical radio in a corner while packing. She pressed the button experimentally, hoping to talk to her mother in the first world one last time. Although Alice from the first world heard the plea, she didn't respond. Her friend's words had made her realize that having even an unfamiliar mother was better than having none at all. After waiting in vain, Alice from the second world finally accepted the reality. Perhaps her mother's choice had already made everything clear. She had chosen to stay with the other Alice and not leave with her. Alice assured her father that she would never bring up her deceased mother again. Meanwhile, Joe sat at an unfamiliar piano, her fingers instinctively dancing across the keys, playing a beautiful melody. She felt like a traveler stranded in a foreign land, homesick and helpless. Just then, Irene entered the room. Joe asked if she was supposed to be dead. There are actually 2 Irenes in the world, and her own situation is just like Irene's. Irene didn't deny it, merely acknowledging that while she understood this truth, it wouldn't help change Joe's circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by the sounds of commotion outside. It was Magnus bringing Alice along. Mother and daughter went to the backyard for an honest talk. Alice displayed a maturity beyond her years, suggesting that since one of them needed a daughter and the other needed a mother, they could try being mother and daughter, even if it didn't mean forgetting their lost loved ones. Joe felt her inner turmoil lift. If even a child could understand this, why had she agonized over it for so long? Maybe it was time to say goodbye to the past and embrace a new life. This change pleased both versions of Magnus, as all they wanted was for their daughter or wife to return to normal and not act as if haunted. Now that both Alice and Joe had managed to do just that, both Magnus finally had the lives they'd been hoping for. In contrast, Henry, who had crossed into the second world, was not so lucky. Calmly hooked up to the lie detector at the police station, he patiently answered all the officers' questions, repeatedly asserting that he hadn't shot Paul. The test results soon confirmed he was telling the truth, yet the officers believed that, while he might sincerely think he hadn't committed a crime, the fingerprint evidence collected at the scene was objective proof. Henry was also charged with another crime, the murder of the detective investigating him on a cruise ship. Poor Henry was completely scapegoated. Meanwhile, in the first world, the instigating Henry, feeling smug, strolled through the streets and even found the detective who had been investigating him in the second world. However, in this world, they had no connection at all. Henry gave him a friendly hug, leaving the detective standing there in bewilderment. Irene, who was about to step down from her position at the space agency, finally understood the uncertainty and suffering Joe had gone through. She decided to expose her own crimes online. For years, she had been assigned a responsibility by the authorities to cover up the disturbing truths about space travel. Some phenomena that astronauts witnessed upon their return might indeed have been real, but she had obscured them with various explanations. In a hospital in the second world, Paul suddenly awoke from his coma, his reaction as if he'd come back from the dead. Meanwhile, Joe's long-lost body, drifting in the vastness of the space station, suddenly reached out to grasp a photo in front of her. It seems that Joe and Paul's original consciousnesses have returned to their respective worlds. It turns out that Henry's destruction of the atomic device wasn't meant to completely sever the 2 parallel worlds, but rather to restore the alternating consciousnesses to their previous state. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.